very good morning to all of you. I'm speaking against this context, especially the subject that I have chosen. It's slightly difficult because I have to take you again back to the central theme that we have slated for this workshop. You know, I have reshaped and dovetailed the entire paper that I wanted to make today in the context of all discussions that we had yesterday and the way that we are approaching this entire problem. You know, I am confining myself to the central theme. I cannot make choices, though there are several areas which are quite tempting, especially discussing police and all. But we have to again look at, if we are analyzing where criminal justice goes wrong, I have two choices. One is that you can conceptually analyze, discuss, theorization part you can discuss, the forms of wrongfulness you can discuss. Now that part is very fascinating, of course, as an academician for me to take up. And I have initially planned my paper because I am a criminal law scholar primarily, so I was quite fascinated to those areas. But then I realized that the other part, which is the second choice for me, which is equally important and pragmatically relevant to this workshop. And the second choice is about the empirical treatment of this problem. So my initial paper was Vulnerability of Miscarriage of Criminal Process in India. Why the criminal justice system at certain stages become vulnerable to various kinds of miscarriage and wrongfulness. That is my, so my scheme is now, I'll very briefly deal with this since I have done it. In the second part, I would be doing a kind of a small demonstration through which I would be able to tell you what could be the empirical treatment of these problems, because any amount of abstract discussion on these issues will not lead us to concretize certain proposals, certain areas which could be pinpointed in terms of its treatment by certain research methods. So we have to zero down certain choices which could be addressed in terms of research and in terms of taking up certain research projects on those areas. So it is all about quantifying wrongful notions of criminal justice. We have to quantify. Conceptually, we may be aware, we may be knowing that this is broadly, but when it comes to researching these issues, the difficulties are there. So one of the concerns that we were debating for this workshop was just one point. We have listed several issues for our discussion tomorrow in the meeting. But one of the things was how to build up or develop methodological skill to be able to handle all these problems. My immediate answer is, we could have a workshop taking up certain issues and how methodologically we can address in terms of developing the proposal and the proposal which could be ready to be implemented in a joint manner. So my presentation should lead to some of these areas. That is my task that I am intending to do today. So first part, in very few minutes, I will do a kind of mapping of wrongful process or miscarriage of justice in the Indian context. Because when I was reading the entire scholarship which has developed, and this paper is, I think many of you must have read, it is Richard Leo and John Gold, studying wrongful conviction, learning from social science. This paper is a methodological document telling about the entire development of scholarship in wrongful conviction research, starting from 1923, Borchardt research, Edward Borchardt was the professor at Yale University. The first work that he has done, Convicting the Innocent, and that work has become a kind of seminal source for inspiration to almost all subsequent studies which have been. And in all those studies, what were the methodological choices on the part of scholars in terms of handling these complex issues? And they have demonstrated that this subject is approachable by research, not by philosophy, not by impressionistic writing, but by sheer research works. So I'm just trying to first look at the issues which could be taken up or which could be seen, and then what could be the methodological treatment. In a very brief time I will be able to do it. The first thing, in Indian context, I find what is the vulnerability of criminal process. We think the pre-trial stages in Indian context are quite vulnerable and susceptible as far as the abuse of process is concerned. Now, pre-trial process could become a very interesting and important subject in order to examine and measure the wrongness. And wrongness from whose perspective? Now, this is very important. If you ask police, they say it's very fine extorting confession and using force is perfectly fine. This is a part of investigation methodology. Therefore, the wrongfulness notion it emanates from the normative considerations. And normative considerations are very clear, and because we follow the due process model. And so my question goes, I think we should start this discussion from here. Whether the nature of criminal justice in a particular society has something to do making it susceptible for a variety of abuses which are indulged in by the agencies of criminal justice system. If I take up this particular notion in the parlance of what Herbert Baker said, he suggested in a given society two types of ideology of criminal justice system are noted. One is crime control ideology and the other is due process. Due process ideology is a normative framework of due process is considered to be right conferring paradigm in which the people enjoy their fundamental freedoms and rights, and police and enforcement agencies work within the framework of that normative system. Now my question is it all well in due process, so-called due process model? Now, due process model is also subverted in a way, because if you look at in Indian context Ranjan Dwivedi case. Ranjan Dwivedi case prolonged for 33 years. It was a minister, railway minister was killed in a blast. 33 years ago, the case is still going on in the court, because whatever protections are allowed in the pre-trial or during trial process, all those have been properly enjoyed by the defense in terms of seeking series of adjournments. And the adjournments have been granted to the defense, and therefore the case. This is a classic example of Kasab case, when we followed due process very intelligently. So several defenses sometimes go counter to the interest of law and order in general. I don't know what is the limit. That's why Baker says limits of criminal sanction. The other model, which is crime control model, which naturally become vulnerable as far as the abuses are concerned. In this model, the onus is on the police to control crime by hook or by crook, and therefore, in most of the countries which are at par with India, several other countries in UK and in US and other places, which are facing the problems of organized crime, drug trafficking, armed dealings, terrorism, they have given a lot of leverage to the police in terms of providing the police some tough laws. Like in India also we have. Now, on the one hand, we are providing them very tougher laws where the period of remand, where the period of conversion, admissibility of a statement, all these things have been granted on a different footing, which are not generally granted in a simple due process model. Now, police, while enjoying the pleasure of implementing these laws, they tend to become extra legal in even ordinary situations. My concern is, it is quite understandable that the law enforcement agencies tend to indulge in law-breaking or high-handedness in extraordinary situations. But what explains the police indulgence in extra-legal measures in ordinary course? There is no answer. In India, both the models are available. I worked in the state of Punjab, which was terrorism-ridden in those days. In post-terrorism phase in Punjab, the biggest question before the state is how to bring back the police to the normal policing. They are struggling because the police has seen the flavor of power while being in that particular phase. So they refuse to come to the normal place. Now this paradox and this dilemma is very mysterious. These are very general notions with regard to the nature of justice. Specific issues I am taking up, which I will translate into empirical references. One is definitely we talk about the unjustified avoidance of conviction. Now there are two sources. One source is alleged defects in substantive criminal law. For substantive criminal law, again as I have given the example, that the choice to criminalize a conduct is the function of the substantive criminal law. Now, sometimes these choices are exercised in a imbalanced manner and therefore a lot of consequences are there. And similarly, the alleged defects in criminal procedure, and also one of the observations which is quite interesting is decision not to charge or prosecute. Now this is very important decision which is taken up day in and day out in the criminal process, and there are several external factors guiding this particular choice, not the normative considerations. It could be the intimidation to the witness, it could be the pressure tactics on the stakeholders or the parties concerned. Therefore, we have to understand how the decisions not to charge or prosecution is taken. Now the other part, I am not going much into unjustified or wrongful convictions because we have been discussing, but this is a subject. And I also see this point that Western literature most of the time has finalized 10 factors. 10 factors they have indicated which are detrimental as far as the wrongful conviction is concerned. And those 10 factors relate to age, then witness, forensic science error, procedural violation, a lot of things. But they have certain 10 factors. But none of those that mainstream Western literature on wrongful conviction has touched upon the way the Indian side perceived this entire process. For us, the wrongful conviction may be the accumulated climax of a process. Like for instance, yesterday Justice Sikri was saying, shoddy, inferior investigation, poor investigation on the part of police is likely to result in wrongful conviction and wrongful acquittal, both. So we have to understand how the criminal justice functionaries from the beginning, like for instance, implicating someone in the FIR registration, implicating someone in the investigation process. It can have detrimental consequences for the outcome. But this thing is happening much earlier. It is not happening at the sentencing stage, and it is not happening at the stage of guilty determination. So we have to understand why there is a opposite process which we are calling, why there are unjustified acquittals. Again, you can reach to two things. There are unjustified acquittals and there are questionable acquittals, which may not be unjustified. Now, when I read a lot of judgments, Mr. Pandey was referring, I find a lot of hypotheses can be extracted from these judgments. Like Vinod Kumar versus Kerala, 2014, the judgment says that the cases where the element of elopement is happening, they are more likely to be charged with rape. I don't know. And court has finally found the person not guilty. The person was found guilty by the trial court. The person was found guilty by the high court. He had to undergo, his career was ruined, he was disturbed, his entire career was spoiled. Finally he was found guilty. And court has pinpointed what are the weak areas in the process. I'll refer to a very important study which was done by Hindu last year. And in this study, because for me these things are not narratives. For me these things are the important sources of hypothesis which could be taken up for empirical examination. That is how I am looking at these things. I am not completely right. When in Akshardham case, the Supreme Court is acquitting 6 persons, despite the killing of 32 people, and court says it is the poor quality of investigation. Now let us examine what do we mean by poor quality of investigation. We have several notions of poor quality of it. What is poor quality? Inadequacy of evidence, insufficiency of evidence, the kind of evidence you wanted were not found, or there is a problem in the forensically validated evidences. What is that? So we do not have the indicators of abuse, we do not have the indicators of wrongfulness in our context, we do not have the indicators of police performance in terms of conducting poor investigation or doing quality investigation. I don't know what is the quality investigation there. You know, because there are several yardsticks and parameters. So I don't want to be judgmental prematurely. Without examining these things on the ground, yesterday CHRI, Subhandha made a brilliant presentation, giving us a concrete profile when prison goes wrong, in terms of performance, in terms of output, in terms of deviating from the professed policy objectives. Now, similarly, we have to find out what is happening in police, because I have some problem. In the law relating to investigation for police, the person can be arrested if the police has reasonable suspicion. Now, this reasonable suspicion is a very dangerous thing. Do you think it is an objective criteria of arresting someone? When police have reasonable information, what is reasonable information? Now, after all, from whose viewpoint is it? From the viewpoint of police. The police officer will say, I have arrested and I have reasonable suspicion that the man has committed crime. So what I am saying, there is a lot of objectivity is needed in terms of really examining these reasons and really looking at. So Hindu study is a very good source of hypothesis, not a dependable information. So they say 40% cases which were brought before the court, they relate to they were released to be rape cases, rape cases. The arrests were made, people were arrested. I think it was some 150 cases, 1,500 cases. 40% cases found to be the cases relating to elopement, where it was a consenting exercise, and only 35% cases were the genuine statutory rape cases. Now, in all these 40% cases, the arrests were made, people were implicated, cases were tried, they were tried in the court of law, and finally they were found. The the victim came out, the so-called victim came out and gave the testimony, but nothing happened. It is the pressure of the parent, it is the pressure of the relative, because immediately when there is such case, the allegation of rape is made, or kidnapping. So a lot of cases are found to be. I am basing my research proposal, which I will be showing in a minute, where I will be taking up this wrongful, implication of the people and how we can approach by way of research in this exercise. Now, the second part of this analysis is, I am not touching it because the rest Professor Rao is dealing. At pre-trial stages, several things are crucial. One is wrongful discharge. Wrongful discharge we have not discussed. We have discussed wrongful acquittal. Wrongful discharge is also a very, very important notion. And I find the court is at lot of discretion in terms of deciding the discharge, even before the beginning of the trial. And wrongful guilty plea, wrongful confession. Now, wrongful confession is a huge case in Akshardham, where the acquittal was solely based on the fact that the confessions were, forced, and the people were made to confess things which they have done few years ago. Now, this thing has come. So I think the research could only be confined, what I am saying in terms of empirical parlance, the study of alleged wrongful confessions in the selected cases in India or in Delhi or whatever. This could be a great research instead of doing alone the wrongful process as a whole. So extracting these things at micro level from these broad processes is something which is very, very important. Wrongful interrogation, wrongful search, wrongful seizure, and the study of wrongfulness on account of misidentification by the witness. Witness tend to. No, witness issue is extremely, typical. I have done a study on 800 witnesses in 4 states, and we have examined that in chain of cases we find that the instances of witness turning hostile has a lot of issues and variety of factors. And they tend to give false statement for variety of pressures, variety of reasons. Yesterday Justice Sikri was saying this. And in India, I think we have not touched, I don't know, in UK it is slightly better. The forensic science is highly unreliable. If you pick up any forensic science level, any state, you will find thousands of cases are pending with them. And the nature of forensic evidence is such that it gets contaminated in a period of time. Suppose it is a viscera sample, it is a semen sample, it's a blood sample. All these samples tend to get contaminated in a period of time. And therefore, their reliability gets drastically reduced. And therefore, the forensic methods in India is a huge risk. So, in the entire project of DNA-based testing which is happening in US, going to be highly precarious in several places. So, we have to revisit these notions. And with this, I am coming to the last part of this analysis. And arrest I am not deliberately, touching because Mr. Rao would be dealing with. But yes, the mapping that I have done, this list goes in 10 areas I have identified: denial of FIR registration, manipulation in FIR, asking for undue and unreasonable attendance of suspects, witnesses. These areas could become independent subject of research instead of doing all in one. Fifth is interrogation related abuse, inadequate or poor investigation, questioning of FIR on flimsy ground. Now, this is a big issue. I don't find this much in Western literature, but in India the High Court has a extraordinary jurisdiction to quash FIR in given cases if the person is moved to the court. Remember in India there was a case in which a lady IAS officer was mistreated, maltreated publicly. FIR was registered and the person culprit was a sitting DGP of the state. No? So the lady who was herself an IAS officer, when she tries to get the FIR registered, she had to face a lot of difficulty in getting the FIR registered because when she went to the police station, she was welcomed that, madam, what happened? Please tell me. This happened. Who is the accused? When the accused name was disclosed, he was the sitting Director General of Police of that state. The SHO didn't have guts to register the FIR. She moved the complaint proceedings before the magistrate, which is another process to get the issue registered. Will you believe the DGP moved to the High Court requesting the questioning of FIR. The questioning of FIR was done in her case, and she had to again go to the Supreme Court. Interestingly, luckily she found a very activist lawyer who has moved hundreds of such cases and fighting for the cause. She brought the matter before the court and showed the kind of impunity the person was having and the brazenness with which it was committed, and the justice was done in that case. So I am telling questioning of FIR, this case is known because it is a high-profile case. I am talking thousands of such cases are present, are installed. Imtiaz Ahmed case, UP, it shows thousands of cases are installed at this stage of investigation. Why? Whose interests are served when investigation is installed at this stage? Police is not to be interfered with the work of investigation. What I am trying to convey is there are several independent critical process capable of disrupting the course of justice, resulting into finally in wrongful conviction or wrongful acquittal, could be individually taken up for empirical verification with the help of data which could be collected. In 5 minutes I will give you the demo and then I will finish. I have time?
Yes, just.
Because that is the added part which I have later done. And this is the applying empirical methods in studying wrongful conviction. This is a proposal. I have done it hurriedly. There may be few things. So 2 proposals I am proposing for our discussion. Study of wrongful conviction in rape cases in Delhi after the year 2000. Now, how this can be done? And second is victims of pre-trial wrongs in northern regions of India and Midlands in the UK, a comparative study of pattern degree and forms. These are the 2 precise projects that we can take up. I can crystallize into the finer workable, measurable parameters, and then we can really launch these 2 studies. I am not taking up both, I am taking the first one. This is a demonstration. It could be developed into a full-fledged study. Second is the comparative study. Midland region, because I have been to Midland for about 1 year, so I know the Midland region very well. Now, we have several models which we can apply. The research could be evaluative, explicative, identificatory impact, what kind of research we want it to be. Fine, if I say it could be identificatory, because the identification of the very fact that wrongful conviction has happened or wrongful acquittal has happened is a big issue. Because wrongful acquittal, because if you ask the other party, he will always say the person was wrongly acquitted. If you ask the defense, they say the person was wrongly convicted. So whose perspective is by the way? This is very important. Now, research design, what could be the, how we can proceed to have the research design? I have posed 10 ways to, unless we ask these questions with regard to the subject that we are discussing, we cannot reach to the main issue. So these are questions we have to answer with regard to the problem. I am not reading this, I am straightway coming to the, this could be the various steps that we can formulate in order to reach to a proper frame of study. I think you can apply this frame to any topic which I have suggested almost 10 subjects. But in case of these 2 subjects, we have to formulate the objectives, we have to formulate the hypothesis, we have to select the sample, we have to collect the data. Now, what are the choices? If I have to apply this model, I have certain choices. The first is that a study has to be objective, reliable, valid, and generalizations. Now, yesterday Professor Pandey has referred the generalization. We are very quick in generalizing without resorting to any empirical. That is the problem with most of the researchers in law. I am telling you, this is the major problem in research. And if, please read, all law researchers must read this paper by Richard Leo. He is criticizing legal research for want of single very important reason at page 60. He said, we are in legal research mostly relying on narratives. A case we study, some narratives are extracted, and we think this narrative is going to be generalized in all such cases which are happening over the globe or in the country, which is not the country. So from the protocols, from the angle of the protocols of research, those could be narratives only applicable to those kinds of cases or for that particular case. So generalizing based on the basis of a particular case or basis of narrative of a particular case is a misleading proposition. Therefore, for want of objectivity, reliability, generalization has to be made based on sufficient observations. Therefore, the methodology of narratives has been vehemently criticized in this particular paper. And he has shown that the narratives could prove to be fallacious in drawing conclusions. So generally we read one cases and we try to generalize that this must be the situation, which is not. Because we are fascinated by these stories. The stories look good, but I think what we need to identify is the pattern, trend, based on sufficient observations. So I'm just now, what could be the focus? You can focus on offense, you can focus on accused profile, you can focus on geography. Like if suppose I do a study on wrongful conviction or questioning of FIR, I can choose rape case, I can choose murder, I can choose loot, I can choose murder, robbery, I can choose. So it could be offense wise, or it could be accused profile wise, young, middle-aged, elder, male, female. So I think we need to identify these parameters in geography. Like yesterday we had discussion, Anup was saying geography is important. Northern region have different things, southern region. So we can locate our study in geographical terms also. Variables. Now this is very important. Ultimately the study has to have the variables. Now what is the wrongfulness? Perceived or actual? Now a study, a Chinese scholar, I think again this study is worth reading. Another methodology by a Chinese study which is there with me, he has done a survey. You can do a survey on the wrongfulness of the process. He has done this survey on more than 5,000 people of different cross sections. So which would be a perceived wrong. If you ask the student or if you ask the traders, if you ask the the people at the street, what is the wrongful conviction? They have their own notion. But that research would be confined to those kinds of response. But sure, so you are doing perceived wrongness or actual. Actual means which is case to case basis. Concocted FIR. Now this can be measurable. We can see whether the FIR has been manipulated. Wrong application of it. Now this can be sufficient. These could be very important, measurable. Forced confession. Wrong choice of evidence. Misidentification. So wrongfulness of the process has to be studied in these terms. These are the possible indicators. I am not saying that this is the exhaustive list of the indicator. This is the illustrative list of the questionable status of forensic evidence. So anybody who is studying questionable status of forensic evidence, in fact, is making a study of the wrongfulness of the process. Now I have some hypotheses. If I have taken that study, elopement is a major factor in causing false allegations of rape by the parents and relatives. We can check these hypotheses. You have to have certain hypotheses to be able to examine. I'm not reading, I think the time is up.
I think so, yes.
Just closing. Please bear with me for another 2-3 minutes. So I'm not reading. These are some hypotheses which I have created for that study. I'm not saying these are the final hypotheses, because my source of hypothesis is my reading on the cases which have been decided in India. Now I want to empirically verify those observations of the court on the ground. That is my research. And this is what I am intending to do in this workshop. So I am not reading just... now what I am doing to, this is a very important facet, indexing wrongfulness. Now wrongfulness is a adjective. But in terms of scientific observation, you have to aggregate and rank the variables to construct the scale for measuring the wrongfulness of process against the normative pole. If observance of the law is the normative consideration, then the notice should be given before the arrest. This is the standard yardstick. Now, the extent to which the police officers are deviating, how often they deviate, and what are the total variables informing this entire index of wrongfulness. So if we are able to create, I think if this workshop could attend to some attention to this, what are the factors which would make the aggregate of the wrongfulness in terms of ranking the variables? Because if suppose there are 10 variables, for you, first questioning of FIR could be the most crucial. For him, the other variable could be crucial. So I think a ranking by the expert is required to be done for forming the index of wrongfulness. This is what I am trying to propose. Survey methodology, comparative methods. Now survey methodology, victimization survey approach. I said identification of wrongfulness is a major issue in a country like India. How we would unearth or explore? We could adopt the victimization survey approach, which is there in the US, which is there in the UK. Other than official crime statistics, you have victimization survey to record the people's experiences with the crime. Why can't we have a victimization survey over a geographical zone, asking the people if they had the experience of any wrongfulness vis-a-vis the police or any other agency of the system? This would give lot of credence to the observation and the generation of the data which are not otherwise available. Otherwise, you will base your study only on the National Crime Record Bureau in India, which is not at all reliable. Comparative methods based on selected variables located in offenders' affairs. This can be done. Matched comparison methods, which Richard Leo applied. Two types of sample he has taken. One is wrongfully convicted, other is wrongfully acquitted. And he has matched what happens in cases of wrongfully convicted people, what was the status of variable. And then he has seen the status of the same variable in the other. This methodology is called matched comparison methods, which could be, I don't have time to elaborate, otherwise I can go on telling you how the variables can be statistically path analysis. Now, path analysis is another technique which is a sort of discourse analysis, uncovering all the facets, which is again probably given in this paper, which could be very, this is a standard technique. These are the standard focus group discussion, scaling, sample. Now, hypothesis testing, a lot of statistics is possible, especially to find the degree of variance in particular outcomes explained by a specific variable. In all the studies throughout, it has been established, it is not a single factor which is responsible for a particular outcome. There is an aggregate of factors. How those factors combine and how they become statistically relevant to cause a particular outcome. And so multivariate regression is the answer in order to understand the individual contribution of the factors with regard to a particular outcome. And these are the doctrinal methods, because I generally deal with empirical and quantitative methodology, but not to discount the importance of qualitative methodology. I am not elaborating. Case study, aggregate case study. You take 5% who have the experience of undergoing wrongful acquittal or conviction, and you can do this aggregate case study to examine certain hypotheses which I have suggested. And narrative analysis and discourse analysis, content analysis of the judgment could be a wonderful. We are experimenting. I teach this methodology at LLM here, and I do engage with the students in actually utilizing these techniques. I have done a lot of content analysis of the cases, and ability to generate quantitative information from the cases is a big leap as far as legal research is concerned. Logical deduction, construct of these methods are available in doctrinal and qualitative methodology, but people generally do not use or not attach much importance to them. So these are few things. I think my time has already run out, and so my idea is, on the one hand, we can conceptually understand this whole notion of the abuse of process. On the other hand, we need to be pinpointed in terms of identifying micro areas in this entire discussion to be able to do some worthwhile empirical research. And this is what I am looking forward for tomorrow's meeting and discussion, so that we can jointly formulate some studies where we can have a comparative contrast of knowing the context of all these problems in two different countries. Thank you for patience.
Thank you very much. Very illuminating and very detailed presentation. And we, I think, all look forward to picking up many of those points tomorrow. And indeed later today. I think the main issue, just before we break for coffee, I think a key issue or a key question that comes out is what we mean by poor quality of investigation. If we're thinking about the pre-trial process, how do we recognise, how do we identify, and how we recognise and how we identify depends on who the we is, whose perspective it is, as to what goes wrong and in what ways it goes wrong and who's affected by it. So what does a poor investigation look like, and the converse is what does a successful system look like? It very much depends on who's looking. The other main issue that you brought up was to put your presentation in the context of Herbert Packer's models of crime, control and due process, which is always a very helpful heuristic device, and yet I think again, if we go back to the point I just made about who's looking, I think Herbert Packer's model and the concept of due process, as it's loosely applied around the world by different actors and different systems, comes back to the issue of whose perspective, because when Herbert Packer was writing in the 1960s, and the Supreme Court was very liberal in the US at the time, he perceived a movement towards a model of quite a pure due process system, and it certainly must have looked that way in the US at the time, and yet what we've seen, especially during Clinton's administration, is a real shift in the notion of what it means to have due process. So I think we must all be very self-critical when we use that term. So if you develop the US example, what you often get there is an idea that if you cross each of these hurdles, if you file that document in time by this time, and if you have been appointed a defence lawyer by the court, you have due process. And yet, if you just look underneath the surface of those protections of the system, what you see is an inadequate defence for indigent defendants, inadequate resources by the court. You have systems whereby if your lawyer, for very good reasons, files your docket 1 minute beyond the timeline, you can be executed despite evidence of innocence. I mean, there is case law on this issue, and yet they will say that is a due process system. But to me, it's a due process system that doesn't have due process as its heart. It just has it as a bureaucratic and administrative notion. So I think whatever perspective you're in, you have to conceptualize what due process means within that system, and that's what anyone doing research of this nature in India would have to do. They'd have to think, what does it actually look like in our system to say that we have in place due process protections? And certainly you talked about timely justice, and again you get caught in a trap if you take the example of California, where people will sit on death row for 30 years, and it's largely, people will say, because of due process, and what it really is an unwieldy appeals process, a 9-stage appeal process that leads to injustice and that leads to people sitting in the kind of conditions not quite of the type that Anna described yesterday, but not that far off. With the psychological torture that brings about, and yet that is about due process of system, they would say, and I would say that it's not due process if it's not timely justice. So again, getting the balance between a thorough and rigorous appeals process and having justice which is not sitting around in the courtroom for 10, 20 years to be administered. We are now rather nicely come to 11:30, and I'm sure people are desperate for a coffee. If we're back by 12 o'clock, something's you want to ask your question now rather than the beginning of next section? Okay, I'll let you. 5 minutes at the most.
Yes?
Yes.
See, there are various contributory factors to the failure of Indian criminal justice system. And time and again we blame this complicated process, incompetency of judges, but we are not in a position to come out with some kind of solution. So my question is, how to ensure the accountability of judges for ignorance of law or otherwise?
You're asking me?
I don't know.
You asked that before she has coffee. It's cruel and unusual.
Absolutely. That is always my question, in fact. Why should anybody change the system when there is so little consequence for doing the wrong thing? When the judge, as we see in our Jodhpur study, when the judge is simply to look up from his table to the person in front of him, just simply look up, and he doesn't do it. And he doesn't do it every day, and he doesn't do it for 50 people. And he knows perfectly well the consequences. There are no consequences for him. There is no consequence for the policeman, there is no consequence for the prosecutor, for the almost who sits on the side and takes money to write down whatever he should be writing down. So if there are no consequences, there's your answer. First he doesn't have a good education, then he doesn't know the law, then he's doing the whole thing in a language that he's not happy with or familiar with. I mean, there's so many things that we could take. But your question is really rhetoric. Your question is, come on, why are we not doing something about it? Don't ask me, I don't know, I just work this system.
Yeah, I think it is not lack of consequences alone. It is very much lack of information. We cannot say why police is acting badly because we lack information. Empiricism is necessary for that, to be able to throw on the face of the police. The information is to the contrary what you are saying. Mr. Judge, the information is to the contrary to what you are saying. Precisely, we have lacked, largely. It is not they alone. Pardon my saying that. They have been able to build that kind of system because we have not been able to generate information enough to critique their system at the right time in the right place. If somebody asks you, do you have a blueprint for criminal justice administration? If you want to remove the police, do you have a blueprint? We don't have. Blueprint should be based on empirical evidence, on researches. This is what people want. In Nepal, when I went and studied with them, in Nepal they had a system of, instead of investigation, they would ask 10 wise men of the community what happened. If that system was replaced by this kind of investigation system, and that system ran for almost 100 years in Nepal. And I think that was much better research. Because no researches were done, and the Western model was investigation with the police, prosecution, and then courts, trial. They replaced it lock, stock and barrel and gave it up. 10 people who were outstanding, a kind of jury system at the investigation stage. That was much better.
Before coffee.
Are you going to leave it to me to say 10 wise women? Surely you meant 10 wise people, including women. Yeah? Yeah, I'm not going to let him answer, we're just going to go for coffee. Okay.